now, and I will send the recording link as well as the deck for people to review. And yeah, so thank you for joining. So we're going to do some intros, then we're going to understand what analytical thinking interview evaluates, some of the common pitfalls to avoid, how to avoid them, and some time for Q&A, which we hopefully will have time for. Okay, let's start with an icebreaker. So in the chat, I would love to know your name, where you're at, and if you prefer your ice cream in a cup or in a cone. I see lots of folks voting for the cone. It's actually funny when I was asking Gamma to make me this slide, it really insisted of making so many cones and very few cups. So I think it's onto something. Awesome. Okay, so I'll introduce myself. I'm Rachel. I am a principal product manager, and I have about 18 years of experience both as an IC and a people manager. I've been at startups, I've been at Meta, Amazon, Datadog. Probably have interviewed about more than 300 candidates by now, more than 100 at Meta. At Meta, I also was a calibrator interviewer, which means I would calibrate product managers to conduct the interviews. And one of my favorite things to do is to coach people and help people advance in their careers through either career coaching, interview preparation, or executive coaching. And this is what a few of my clients say about me. You can also refer to my service page on LinkedIn, ask me on email to share a bigger list, or look at my website, pmadvising.com. So, what does the analytical thinking interview aim to evaluate? Really, what it looks for, and this changes a bit as you're growing more senior in your career, is how you're able to set up products and teams for success at scale. So when you're at a junior level, it's really about understanding why a product exists, how you're measuring it, and why it's important. When you're becoming more senior, it turns into more of how do you set goals according to what the product is meant to do for your team. And if you're a people manager or as you're approaching the principal level or the senior principal level, it's really about understanding how teams and individuals are performing in accordance to the goals that you're setting. At the executive level, when you're already managing multiple teams or you're a senior principal who is advising on that, it's really about establishing the product organizations and set them up for success, setting up product portfolios and multiple orgs to work together in symphony. Oops, I do not know why this is not going to the next one. So what does this actually mean in terms of the key signals that are evaluating? You need to be able to define your product rationale. You need to be able to set up metrics to evaluate success. You need to translate these metrics into goals for a product or a team. You need to navigate your trade-offs. And with AI changing how we operate, I set up this separately, but this would also actually be in any of these. But I wanted to treat this separately as it's a relatively new concept, so I wanted to make sure we give it attention. So when you're thinking about how these signals look like, and when you're defining the product rationale, it's really what is the problem that it solves and who does it solve it for? Why does it even matter? And how does it align with the company's mission or the greater org's mission? When you're thinking about measuring success, can you prioritize a North Star metric? And I'll spill the beans here. There is no one perfect North Star metric. They all come with flaws, so this is a bit about prioritization as well. Do you understand its shortcomings? Are you accounting for your ecosystem or other features? Um, both sides of, like, if you're in a marketplace, you want to make sure that you're accounting for the buyers, the sellers. If you're in social media, the content creator, the content consumer. Can you define your supporting metrics? And can you identify guardrails or counter metrics, which would be what your product interacts with? When you're thinking about setting goals for a product or a team, the first question is, do you know the difference between a metric and the goal? And what factors do you consider in order to set those goals? Navigating trade-offs is really about, the first thing you want to do is really say, what is it that you're trading off between? What are the principles that you're going to use to navigate that trade-off? And how do you weigh overarching goals when you're negotiating trade-offs? Meaning, if one metric is up and one metric is down, how do you set it up from an organizational level? And then when you're thinking about AI implications, the first thing is, what are the AI challenges and opportunities? And you don't want to AI slap on everything because you're just going to confuse your users. Do you understand AI incentives? These are highly optimized systems. If you set the wrong incentive, it's going to be garbage in, garbage out. And what are the risks of implementing AI, like hallucination? So another thing I want to make sure that is clear, because preparation materials and analytical thinking interviews don't actually tell you all of the questions that are available, because candidates don't always know to differentiate between a follow-up question and an actual question. So in an analytical thinking interview, you can expect probably 3 to 4 questions, not one. And I'm breaking it down so you can see. So in many cases, you're going to start with, what is the mission? The second will be, what goals do you set? And in that context, the North Star metric is baked into the goal, but it's not enough to say what the North Star metric is. It's also translating it into goals. Then you have your trade-offs. A very popular trade-off is, an engineer on your team wants to build something. Do you do it and do you not? And in this case, I'm giving you a promotional unit on newsfeed. Do you build it? Do you not build it? And then let's assume you build it. You see that time on newsfeed is down, but your marketplace transactions are up. What do you do? So these are 2 types of trade-offs that you have. One is a feature trade-off. The other one is a metric trade-off. So this means you need to be smart about how you're managing your time. So these are the common pitfalls that you want to avoid, and we'll go deeper into them. You want to make sure you don't run out of time. You want to make sure that you really say what the why is, and you really don't want to use blanket terms like engagement. Those of you who joined my Product Sense Pitfall workshop or watched it know that I speak about it also in the Product Sense context as well. When you're setting up your metrics, often candidates go into the wrong level of detail, or they make metrics that are really complicated to explain, to debug, and use for a team to be motivated. And they don't really self-critique their metrics. And as I said earlier, there is no one perfect metric. Another common confusion that I see is that candidates conflate goals with their measurements, with their roadmap. These are not the same things, and we'll talk about them. And when you're when you encounter a trade-off, I see candidates jumping directly into the solutions of how to navigate the trade-off before telling me what the trade-off is and why it matters. And especially in the world of AI, if you're just going to slap a solution on everything before understanding the problem and defining the principles that you want to operate by, you're just going to create a very confusing experience for your users, and you might find yourself actually overreacting to novelty effects, which are the early signs of a change in a feature. And then the final one is handing the keys over to AI without giving it a second thought. If you don't understand your optimization factors, if you don't understand guardrails and set them appropriately, or if you're just slapping AI just because AI is cool and everybody's using it, you're going to create a very bad user experience. Okay? So I want to also emphasize, practice makes permanent, not perfect. In many cases, when I work with clients, I find myself correcting bad habits that they've implemented. If you are cracking 100 cases in your prep and you're repeating the same mistakes over and over again, you're not actually improving, you're burning yourself out, and you're implementing bad behaviors that are later very hard to correct. Debrief is the most important piece of your preparation when you're conducting mock interviews. And if there are clients of mine here, they will attest that I record every interview and I make them watch it, especially the areas where they mess up, so they can see it and understand. So for every hour of prep that you do in a live mock interview, you should be recording that mock interview, watching it, and evaluating not if your answer is correct or not, but what is your thought process and how are you doing on those signals that we discussed earlier? Okay, so I'm going to start with the pitfalls, and I'm going to start with time management and how to manage your time better. So I mentioned earlier, we have about 3 to 4 connected questions, not one. And the way I like setting it up is when you're thinking about your product rationale, you could give yourself up to 7 minutes to do it. Understand the context, the competitive environment, why this feature is important, who are the users that it's serving, right? What is the mission and vision alignment? And what is the problems for your key users? Now, unlike product sense, when you're going to go into deep segmentation, it's okay here to keep it high level. This isn't a product sense interview. Just important, if you do not understand the problem that you're setting, and we'll talk about this later, you cannot set metrics, you cannot set goals, and you cannot navigate trade-offs. This is the bare basics. Then you want to establish goals, and that's going to take you about 10 minutes. And you want to set up your North Star metric, and that includes self-critiquing your North Star metric. If you don't do it for yourself, your interviewer will do it, and that might make you lose confidence. So you also don't want to be defensive on it. You want to set your supporting metrics because that metric isn't perfect, and you want to set your guardrails. Then when you're thinking about establishing goals, you want to translate your metrics into goals, and that goes into understanding what is your product life cycle, what is the business goals, how has the team been performing. That takes about 5 minutes as well. And then when you're thinking about navigating trade-offs, you really want to start very quickly with defining what the trade-off is, understanding what the trade-off impact is on the ecosystem, and then dive deeper into the trade-off. And then finally, define and suggest optimizations if needed, if you can't make a clear call. And I want to call out, in many cases, you're not actually going to say, launch this or take this back. In many cases, it's about finding how to balance and what is the impact on the ecosystem. Okay, so the second pitfall that you have is missing out on the product rationale, and that's really forgetting the why or using blanket terms like engagement, which will use you the interviewer's trust. So what I see candidates do is they create some sort of a mission statement, and more often than not, they kind of like take the parent's org or the company's mission, and they just force whatever problem statement is at hand into the mission statement. So, for example, they will say, Facebook's mission is to build community. Marketplace creates a place where users can engage in social buying. They're not really telling me the problem, the alternatives, why do this versus something else. What you want to do instead is, yes, you want to state what the overarching mission is, and you want to state who is it for, what is the problems that it solves, what are the alternatives, and how does this ladder up to the mission once you've done that? Who are the key users? And, if you're thinking about a marketplace, you're thinking about both buyers and sellers. And why are you investing in this versus something else? So I'm giving an example that would be like how you would summarize these findings for Facebook Marketplace. So Facebook's mission is to build community. And then the problem is people buy and sell locally on Craigslist, think there's cash involved, you're going to meet somebody face to face. Where's the trust? That's a bit scary. So the opportunity that Facebook has is enable local commerce that is built with trust because you have the social graph. You can see your mutual friends, you can verify the identity, and then that means that you are turning transactions and you're baking in the trust because of the community aspect. I will also say that Facebook had a lot of evidence before it put marketplace in, and this is a very common interview question of how would you validate something? You would see a lot of interactions on Facebook groups, for example, especially location-based groups, where people who are moving would look to sell a sofa or would look to buy a TV. And so those were very strong indications that there was a need for marketplace and that people were looking to conduct that within the community. So want to call this out. Engagement. Anybody who's done my product sense workshop probably recognizes this slide. People say engagement and they use it as a blanket term. And when you are just saying engagement as a blanket term, you lost the interviewer's trust. You can say engagement, but you need to explain what this means. And then I saw a question on the chat that we're trying to humanize the mission. Yes, we're trying to humanize the mission. So you could use engagement, but you need to explain what this means. A like is not the same as a comment, is not the same as a share in a DM to a friend. I just showed you the hierarchy where the most meaningful interaction, both in terms of value to user and in terms of value to the ecosystem, is sharing the item in a DM to a friend. Why? Because it makes you care about somebody so much. Sorry, you're thinking about somebody so much that you want to send them something and you're continuing the conversation. So what you want to do is you want to define the specific behavior and why that behavior indicates value. So candidates often say the North Star of Instagram Reels should be engagement. But what does it actually mean? Is it comments? Is it likes? Is it shares? Is it creation? By the way, when I was working at Instagram, cleaning up the incentive of content creation on Instagram took a few years off my life. What you should do instead is you want to define the specific user behavior. And what you want to say is, what is the behavior that you want to use? And for example, it can be users sharing reels to their stories or to their friends in a DM. Why is this behavior important? They want to share the content that is relevant to their friends, something they found funny, something they found meaningful, something that they made them think that their broader network would be interested in it. Why is it good to users, right? Why is it good for you to share something in a DM? Well, maybe it's a way to connect with someone that you haven't connected with in a very long time. And this is almost like an icebreaker, right? And why does it benefit the ecosystem? Well, I think at this point, if somebody is sharing to somebody as a DM, if you think about it from a notification standpoint, that person gets a notification that they might have not otherwise seen. And it's a meaningful notification because it's from a friend. So they will click in and go back into the platform. And so you're seeing, and they'll see something from their friend and they'll continue talking to their friend so they'll spend more time on the platform. All of this is adding value, but you can see how just saying engagement versus going through this analysis creates two very different perceptions from the interviewer onto your performance. So to summarize this, if you cannot define it precisely, and I'm not saying be overly verbose, then you are vague and your team doesn't know what to execute on it. And, vague language signals vague thinking. Okay, common mistakes in measuring impact. So, 3 things: wrong level of detail, overly complicated North Star metrics, and no self-critique. So when you're thinking about your North Star metric, this is the metric that your team is going to look for. Sometimes, by the way, you can't actually goal directly on your North Star metric. For example, when I was working on ranking for Facebook Dating's mission was to help people start meaningful relationships, whatever that means for them. And ideally, we would want to measure relationships. But we can't really measure relationships, and there's a lot of reasons why we could do it. The closest thing we could do was actually measure conversations on Facebook Dating. So that was ended up being our North Star metric. But our overarching North Star metric was actually relationship started. So it's important to understand what your North Star is versus what you can measure or not. And that also goes into setting goals, which we'll talk about later. So wrong level of details in the metric. In many cases, the two problems that I see here in terms of the level of detail is one is you're only thinking about your one side of the marketplace. So you might only track buyer metrics or you might not track seller metrics. When you're thinking about the other direction is I get a lot of times candidates or clients just giving me a laundry list of measurements that they want to use, and that doesn't show prioritization. And so it's really important as product managers, especially as we become more senior, it's not about showing that we can think about every metric under the moon. It's about prioritizing. What is the most important metric? What are the ones that are supporting? Almost imagine, and this is also a very common interview question, how would you organize your metrics in a dashboard? If you're thinking about it in that frame, you can imagine that your North Star or your North Star approximation is going to be the biggest dashboard in the middle, and then your graphs below it are going to be your supporting metrics. When you're thinking about your measurement setting, what I like to do is your North Star, and I think this is probably the fourth or fifth time I'm saying it today, it's never going to be perfect. You want to think about your supporting metrics, and when you know that your North Star isn't perfect, you also know what metrics you need to bring in to support it. And here you want to think about things like the AARR framework, life cycle, ecosystem balance. You might also want to think about overarching metrics that your org has. So for example, if you're thinking about Instagram Reels, you might want to measure, number of daily active users who are meaningfully engaging with Reels, and that means they're either commenting or sharing in a DM, right? But then you might also want to see what is Instagram's daily active users or things like that to make sure that you can easy correlate. You also want to have your guardrails and your counter metrics. So if we're thinking about Instagram Reels, you might want to think about that versus stories as something that trades off. But really, what are the trade-offs that you see, right? Or because Reels is video content that is more passive consumption, maybe it means that you are not measuring, like maybe you actually need to think about meaningful engagement versus time spent, right? So really think about what are your guardrails and countermetrics. And then you want to prioritize by stage. So when you're thinking about your product, a newer product, you want to focus on activation. A mature product, you want to focus on retention. And here it's really important. Your job as a PM is not to create laundry lists. It's really distill the information and shed light on what is important. Okay, this next thing I'm going to say is don't choose overly complicated North Stars. So for example, saying something like like for an AI chatbot, a daily active user is sending 3 to 5 messages to the AI bot, that is a very complicated metric. Why 3 or why 3 to 5? What happens if it's 7? What's happened if it's 1? We'll talk about it in the AI incentives, but what might actually happen is that you're incentivizing the AI to prolong conversations, and that's not great. That's not a great way to incentivize the AI. You want the AI to be incentivized on being as helpful as quickly as possible, right? Or percentages metrics, you can do them. It's not always wrong, but when you're doing a percentage metric, you then need to debug both your numerator and your denominator, which makes it a bit more complicated to debug. I have seen this happening, like I've goaled on these in the past, but it's usually not the recommendation, and it's usually not something that you're going to set as a North Star. It might be a feeder into your North Star because it's so complicated. Somebody might tell me, well, what about ranking systems when you want to have, CTR as an indication of relevance, because the higher click-through rate, the better the relevance. But that would incentivize you, one, to be overly exploitative, which means you would create a superstar problem and you would starve content that doesn't have enough eyeballs yet. So this is an example why setting up CTR as your North Star can end up being the wrong thing to target on. So what I would want to say is a good example of a North Star could be something like daily conversations between buyers and sellers for a marketplace, or people who find value in the product so much that they come back again and again and they meaningfully interact with it. But you want the metric that you're setting to be simple, debuggable, and hard to gain. Your North Star indicates the feeders to the North Star, and this is what you're going to use in order to set up your team for a success. Don't fall in love with your North Star either. In many cases, what I see is that candidates spend a lot of time, they think about it, they set up their metrics, they have their North Star metric, and when the interviewer tries to get them to acknowledge the shortcomings of their North Star, they get defensive, they lose confidence, and if you lose confidence at this stage of the interview and you're really 10 minutes in, you're going to mess up the rest of the interview. So when you're self-critiquing your North Star metric, what you're actually showing is awareness and thoughtfulness and judgment and forward planning, because then you're going to be selecting better supporting metrics. So if I'm thinking about Facebook Marketplace, for example, I gave that as daily conversations between buyers and sellers. Biggest shortcoming is it doesn't actually measure transactions. But Facebook Marketplace doesn't handle payments. And even if it did, in many cases, these transactions end up being in cash because people meet face-to-face and they end up preferring doing this in cash. If you're going to spend $2,000 on a sofa from somebody you've never met, are you really going to pay them in advance? You're probably going to pay them at the point of meetup, right? It doesn't even measure transaction success or satisfaction. And it could include spam or low intent conversations. So these are some of the supporting metrics that I would try and set up for it. Okay, goals do not equal measurement, do not equal roadmap. And this is something that I see a lot. I ask candidates or clients, how would they set up goals for the team? And then they start giving me a roadmap, or then they just give me the North Star. Now, if you're L4, L5, you might be forgiven for this, but at the L6, L7 rate and above, you need to be able to understand the differences between goals, measurements, and roadmap. So the North Star metric is your metric, and sometimes you might have two, that signals your direction, your aspiration. 99.9% of the time, it's the metric that tells you that you solved a problem. Goal is what is the movement what is the target that you're setting for your team? What is the goal that you're setting to know that you're moving in the right direction? It might be something that is directly on the North Star metric. It might be feeding into the North Star metric. And as you're becoming more senior and you're thinking about product portfolios, you might have different product teams contributing to your North Star metric feeders, right? So if you're thinking about, Facebook dating, ranking might be contributing to your initial likes, right? And a team around engagement that focuses on the UX of the chat might be measuring responses to chats, or might be measuring on chats initiated by creating something like an icebreaker in the chat to make it less overwhelming. And then your roadmap is the launches and initiatives to reach it. So in the example I gave, the icebreaker would help that engagement team start initial conversations, and initial conversations help drive bi-directional conversations. And the The one thing that I'm missing here is the measurement, which I'll talk about this in a second, okay? So as I mentioned, you don't want to say my goal is engagement. You don't want to say my goal is to ship these 5 features. Goals are not roadmap. We spoke about this. So when you're thinking about setting the goals from your actual North Star, you want to think about how does your North Star ladder into your inputs? What is the reality? So a newer product is, or an early stage product, you might be thinking about 10 to 20%. If you're thinking about a very mature surface, you're probably going to think about the single digit percentages. Your product life cycle, where are you in the life cycle? Are we focusing on acquisition, or are we focusing on retention, or are we focusing on revenue? And by the way, you do not need to spit out the entire AARRR framework. And for anybody who doesn't know, I think I needed to have an E here. By the way, it's activation, engagement, retention, referral, revenue, if I'm not mistaken. So you don't necessarily need to throw the entire set of metrics, but it's enough for you to say, I'm in the acquisition phase, so I want to focus on users who are joining, or I'm in the retention phase, I want to focus on users coming back again and again. You want to do a top-down, bottoms-up exercise, which means what are the business needs? That's the top-down. And the bottom-up is what can this team realistically deliver? If you just had layoffs and you lost half the team, are you really going to set a more ambitious target? Maybe if you have enough, AI advancements, maybe if you don't have any tech debt to clean, but these are types of things that you're really thinking about when you're setting goals. And then you want a sanity check. What can the team deliver? What are your constraints? What are your guardrails? And does it pass the sniff test? The reality is, especially as you're L6, L7 and beyond, and you sat in these goals discussions, if you set it too low, leadership ends up doubting you and might force extremely ambitious targets that will then be very hard to attain. And if you set it too high, you're going to find yourself doing endless reviews explaining why you're missing your target. So you want to think about ambitious but attainable. And this is an example of how this could come up in a summary section of your answer. This is a mature surface and this is your team capacity. You would target this type of improvement, thinking about, your reality. And if we could deliver, higher if the team health is strong, or lower if the team health isn't good. And then you want to guardrail on your kind of like, what is the engagement? Like, are you balancing what type of engagement you're balancing for, and keeping integrity flat, meaning that you are not gamifying the system and that you're not creating bad experiences for users. Okay, now I know a lot of you that we were supposed to go into the Q&A section now, and I mentioned in the beginning that I thought we were going to run over. I think we have about 10 minutes left. We're almost done with trade-offs, and then we'll go into AI and QA. So if anybody needs to run, I understand this. I just want to answer a question from Jessica. Does setting goals mean, wait, lots of... Okay, so Jessica's asking, does setting goals mean explaining context, setting North Star metric? So when you're looking to set goals, usually what you're going to do is you can't set a goal without having the North Star first. Now, when you're trying to translate that North Star into a goal, you might actually not be able to influence the North Star directly. Or if you're very early in the product, you might need to start with the feeding metrics. So the way I would say it is I would define the North Star, your supporting metrics, diagnose the lifestyle, diagnose the business needs, and then translate that into goals. Okay. And then for those of you who need to run, I will send the recording so that you can watch this later. Okay, not weighing in on trade-offs. So in many cases, and this is where a lot of times the materials, like if you're looking at the Lewis C. Lin spreadsheets and all of that, candidates don't, in many cases, run out of time and don't actually get to the trade-off section of the questions, or when they're filling up that form, they forget about it. So this is where I feel like preparation material really doesn't go very deep. So when you're thinking about a trade-off, an example question could be an engineer on your team wants to launch a promotional unit for a marketplace on newsfeed. What do you do? And when you're thinking about a promotional unit for marketplace on newsfeed, and by the way, that newsfeed, that item would be called, the unit would be called marketplace products you may want to buy. So it would show you a few marketplace items on your newsfeed. And essentially, there are two types of trade-offs that you can think of right off the bat, right? Newsfeed content is the center page of Facebook. It's where you come when you, sorry, it's the entry space to Facebook where you come, you see content from your friends, you see recommended content. It's also very monetizable. So the first trade-off that you can think of is marketplace versus other types of content. What is worth more? The second level of trade-off you can think about, well, if you're now showing products on newsfeed that are recommended to users, you might be dropping intent. So you might see conversations volume increase substantially, but you might actually see or initial messages sent increase dramatically, but your sellers who are getting these messages might get overwhelmed and then not respond. So you might actually, so these are the two trade-offs, and you can probably think about other ones. For example, are these marketplace units relevant, which goes back to the first trade-off that I said where it conflates with newsfeed. So I'm just giving you this as an example, right? But the first thing you want to say is, what is the trade-off? So let's say, what are the bad approaches that you want to do? After launching marketplace recommendations in newsfeed, time on newsfeed is down 0.1%, but your transactions are up 10%. What do you do? Candidate says, I'd run an A/B test to see if we should roll back. And the knee-jerk reaction of an A/B test is the mechanics of the trade-off. It doesn't actually ask the question of, what is going on overall for Facebook? Is this actually improving time spent on Facebook? Do we see ad revenue decrease? Do we see that these users are better retained or not? These are some of the questions that you want to ask. Then when you're digging deep, who is it that is spending less time? What type of, is the type of content that they're missing on, right? Another thing would be let's just roll it back. You really want to call out what is the actual trade-off and what is the real impact. And the real impact is usually what happens to your overarching goal. You want to debug before you decide, right? So we speak about the trade-off is newsfeed engagement versus marketplace transactions. So feed is your core product. It's a daily usage. It's ad revenue. Marketplace is utility. It's kind of like where people go to interact on transactions. And then you want to debug. How is overall retention going on? What types of users are losing time on newsfeed? Are they the power users? Are they casual? What is the impact on overall ad revenue? Do we see any value difference? Marketplace users versus feed-only users? And there's also the very good question of, is 0.1% statistically significant? In the world of meta, it is. Okay, so what you want to do is really describe the trade-off, and you want to go deeper before you talk about testing or optimizing. Okay, now we're going to go into AI common pitfalls, because AI is becoming more and more prominent in our day-to-day lives as product managers and also in our interview questions as well. You don't want to hand over the keys to AI without giving it a second thought. So the key things I want you to take away from here are, you want to make sure you understand at a high level what is your AI optimizing for. You want to make sure you have AI guardrails, and you do not want to use AI just to use it. Okay, optimization functions. So when you're thinking about AI systems, and this can be LLM, generative AI. You can think about reinforcement learning models for ranking decisions or for content distribution decisions. If you put in the wrong incentives, you're going to get out the wrong outcomes. So if you're going to measure number of AI messages in terms of pings and pongs for the thread, you might actually have the AI taking unhelpful responses that drag out conversations unnecessarily, and then you're going to get frustrated users. If you're going to goal on user satisfaction ratings, by the way, I really don't like using user satisfaction or user reports as metrics because these are subjective metrics that are easy to game. For example, if you're thinking about getting high user satisfaction ratings, the AI might be overly agreeable and just tell users what they want to hear, and then you might lose accuracy. On the other hand, if you're optimizing not to get user reports, well, user reports are subjective and the harm might already be done. So that's another thing you want to consider about. Engagement with AI content, that can get you to the clickbait problem, and that could degrade user trust over time. And then number of the AI suggestion accepted, it's very similar to the previous one, and it's very similar to what I said beforehand with ranking, but it could make low value suggestions, and the impact isn't that great. So when you're thinking about this, you want to optimize for the user outcomes, task completion rates, accuracy and helpfulness that is verified, time saved on actual task. And you always want to have AI-specific guardrails. We'll talk about this in a second. Hallucination rates, bias monitoring, which is a huge one if you're thinking about AI systems. They perform without even going to other types of bias. AI models on English work so much better than any other language. And that trickles down into other factors like gender, like race. It's the same thing. Whatever your sample is and wherever you're doing to debias is going to indicate your overall accuracy. Transparency and human oversight. In many cases, we are seeing human in the loop as a very common practice to help shadow some of these. Okay, don't overuse AI to confuse your users. So this is something that I'm seeing more and more. AI summary for like a 3-sentence email. Why do we need this? Ask AI buttons everywhere. And that's the first thing, like the feature overload. The second is user confusion. In customer service tools, if the user can't say if it's AI or a human, it's going to be something that hurts user trust. And then you might be creating a cognitive overload. And this is something that actually one of my executive coaching clients who has a SaaS product says at some point they were launching many, many features for AI, and they were getting a ton of negative feedback from their users that were getting very confused by all of these new features. Why does AI come everywhere? So really think about what are the problems that you want to solve with it, where does it really add value, and where does it just create clutter? So really before you're adding AI to your function is the first thing is, does it solve a real user problem? Will users know when and how to use it? Is AI the best solution here? And is there enough transparency? And I think, good versus bad. I think, Gmail Smart Compose is a very good example. Grammarly is a very good example. But you really want to avoid overwhelming users. And then probably should have started with this, but AI-specific guardrails. The 3 things you want to think about when you're thinking about setting guardrails for AI: hallucination, bias and fairness, and transparency and human oversight. And what this means is if you're saying my North Star is daily AI chatbot conversations, and your guardrail is retention stays flat and conversations with friends stay flat, which is your traditional, with AI, you want to think about additional guardrails, which is your hallucination rate, the performance across languages, and the percent user reports. I'm not loving the percent user reports, even as I critique myself for the 2 reasons that I gave, which is harm has already been done. and it is subjective, but it does give a sentiment level understanding. So these are really important guardrails to consider when you are thinking about AI implementation in the context of analytical thinking. Okay, so when you're thinking about these guardrails in practice for a customer service chatbot, you want to think about hallucination under 1%. This isn't a metric, but you want to be able to still give users the ability to escalate to a human. You want to make sure that PII isn't leaked. That's really important, especially with these large models, and that you're using a good tone. And so really you want to think about, these types of guardrails that you're putting in. Okay, you survived the pitfalls. So what we're going to do next is we're going to do feedback while you ask me for questions. So there are two ways of accessing feedback. You can scan it here with the QR code if you have a phone, or you can use the type form here. In terms of the next steps, please submit feedback. Then I want you to review your notes and even watch this recording again, maybe after you tried one of these questions again. And I want you to practice an analytical thinking question and see if anything changes from you based on the session that we just had today. And so I really appreciate your feedback. I think the best practice is right away. So I would try this out over the next 48 hours. Another thing I'll say, which isn't announced here yet, and I forgot to plug it into to the slides, is there's a lot of anxiousness with product managers that I see around system design. So in 2 weeks, at the same time, I am partnering with a wonderful AI engineer who is also really good at instructing engineers on system design. And he's partnering with me to help product managers understand what system design is for product managers, how you're evaluated on it, how to think about it, and how to prepare for such interviews, or how to make sure that you understand the architecture of your systems, because with AI, MCPs and agents, understanding how things connect are really important at scale. So this is coming up in 2 weeks. It will be in the email. It will be on Maven as a free lightning session. So I'll share about that later. And I'm going to stop the recording so people can ask me questions if you still have any. And thank you so much for those of you who cannot stick around for longer.